The wind was a thief in the Wyoming basin, stealing the warmth from Ilara's bones and the hope from her heart. It scoured the hardpan earth, carrying with it the grit of her failed ambitions and the ghosts of laughter her small cabin had never known. The land itself felt barren, a cruel mirror to the diagnosis that had shattered her world. A malformed womb, Mrs. Thorne, the doctor in Lammy had said, his words clinical and cold, delivered with a dismissive pity that stung worse than the pronouncement itself. You will not carry a child to term. It would be a mercy for you to accept it, mercy. The word had soured on her tongue for 2 years. There was no mercy in the silence that followed her husband's death in the blizzard of '78, no mercy in the pitying glances of the townsfolk who saw her as a woman twice cursed, a widow and barren. She was an incomplete sentence, a story without a final chapter. The homestead, once a testament to shared dreams with her Thomas, was now just a collection of slowly decaying timber and broken promises, clinging to a landscape that offered no comfort. She felt the desolation in her very marrow, a hollowness that the wind seemed to keen through. Every morning, the vast, indifferent sky pressed down, and every evening, the encroaching shadows whispered of her profound and unending solitude. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her belly that tightened with every unfamiliar sound, with every creak of the porch boards that wasn't her own. She was a woman alone, a target for the cruelties of both nature and men who saw opportunity in her vulnerability. This land did not forgive weakness, and she felt herself growing weaker with each passing day, shrinking under the weight of a future she had been told she could never have. The dust settled on everything, the rough-hewn table, the quilt on her empty bed, the surface of the water in the bucket, a fine, gritty layer of despair. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the cruel landscape in strokes of bruised purple and melancholic orange, he appeared. He did not ride up with the clatter of hooves and tack that announced visitors, but materialized from the twilight like a spirit of the dust itself. He stood at the edge of her cleared land, a tall, still figure outlined against the fading light. Modoc, she knew from the cut of his buckskins and the proud, stoic set of his shoulders. An exile, far from the lava beds of his people's last stand. She had heard the whispers in town, cruel tales of the warrior remnant scattered by the army, branded as savages. Her hand flew to the worn stock of the rifle resting by the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was the embodiment of the untamed wilderness she feared, a physical manifestation of all the unknown dangers that lurked beyond her fence line. He made no move, simply watched the cabin, his gaze unreadable from this distance. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence broken only by the ceaseless wind. He held no weapon in his hands, but she knew that meant little. He was the weapon. Finally, he took a slow step forward, then another, his movements deliberate, unthreatening. He stopped at the broken section of her fence, the part Thomas had meant to fix before the snows came. He looked at the splintered rails, then back at her, a silent question in his posture. He was close enough now for her to see the hard lines of his face, the deep-set eyes that held a sorrow as vast and stark as the land itself. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture of peace, and pointed to his mouth, then to the well. Water. He was asking for water. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to raise the rifle and shout him off her property. But in his eyes, she saw not menace, but a weariness that resonated with her own. He was an outcast, just as she was. He was alone, just as she was. Against all reason, against the tremor in her hands, she gave a slow, hesitant nod. His name, she learned, was Cale. He did not offer it freely, but spoke it a few days later in a low, quiet voice when she asked, the single word seeming to cost him a great deal. In exchange for water and a share of her meager stores, he began to work. He did not ask permission. He simply saw what was broken and mended it. The first task was the fence. He moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch, his hands sure and skilled as he replaced the splintered rails with wood he sourced from a fallen cottonwood down by the creek bed. He worked from sunup to sundown, the rhythmic thud of his axe a new, strangely comforting sound in the lonely expanse. Ilara watched him from the cabin window, the rifle never far from her reach. She was a creature of suspicion, her trust a currency she no longer possessed. She studied him for any sign of aggression, any hint of the savage the townspeople described. She saw none. He was quiet to the point of seeming mute, his presence a solid, grounding force rather than a threat. When the pump on her well seized up with a gut-wrenching screech of rusted metal, a wave of despair washed over her. It was her lifeline. Without it, she would have to abandon the homestead. She had spent a whole morning struggling with it, her hands raw and bleeding, her frustration mounting to tears. Cale had approached without a word, gesturing for her to step aside. She watched, ready to flee, as he dismantled the complex mechanism with a series of precise, knowing movements. He seemed to understand the language of iron and wood, of stress and leverage. He spent hours cleaning the components, reshaping a warped piece of metal with a hammer and a heated stone, his focus absolute. When he reassembled it, the handle moved with a smoothness she couldn't remember it ever having. Clean, life-giving water gushed forth. He looked at her then, a brief, questioning glance, and she could only nod, a lump of gratitude and confusion caught in her throat. He had saved her, and he had asked for nothing. A silent rhythm began to form between them, an unspoken partnership born of necessity. Each morning, he would be gone before the sun crested the mountains, returning in the afternoon with a rabbit or a brace of grouse slung over his shoulder. He would leave the game on the porch, a silent offering, and retreat to the small lean-to he had constructed against the side of the barn, giving her space. He never tried to enter her cabin without being invited. In the evenings, Ilara would leave a plate of hot food for him on the porch railing, stewed rabbit, pan-fried potatoes, whatever she could spare. It was a trade. His skill for her hearth. His protection for her sustenance. The silence that had once been a vessel for her fear slowly transformed. It became a shared space, a quiet understanding that required no words. She found herself observing the small details of his existence. The way he would pause and lift his head to the wind, as if listening to a conversation she could not hear. The intricate, almost reverent way he cleaned his kills, wasting nothing. She saw him one afternoon by the creek, standing stock-still as a doe and her fawn drank from the water not 10 yards away. He had his bow, but he made no move to draw it. He simply watched them, and in that moment, she saw not a hunter, but a guardian. One evening, a storm rolled in, a violent tempest of hail and furious wind that threatened to tear the roof from the cabin. The sound was deafening, the world outside a terrifying chaos. She sat huddled by the fire, jumping at every crash and shudder of the old logs. A particularly violent gust ripped a shutter from its hinge, and it slammed against the wall with the force of a battering ram. Before she could react, the cabin door opened, and Cale was there, the storm raging behind him. He didn't speak, just moved to the window, pulling the broken shutter inside and bracing the opening with a heavy piece of wood from her dwindling pile. He checked the other windows, his presence a sudden, shocking shield against the storm's fury. When he was satisfied, he turned to the hearth. He added 2 large logs to the dying embers, coaxing the flames back to a robust, comforting roar. He lingered there for a moment, his back to her, and the space between them felt charged with all the things they had never said. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then, as quietly as he had entered, he was gone, back into the maelstrom to his own cold shelter. That night, for the first time in a long time, Ilara did not feel entirely alone. The turning point came on a cold, brittle autumn afternoon. Ilara was sorting through the small trunk that held the last vestiges of her life with Thomas. In it was a tiny pair of woolen booties she had knitted in the first flush of their marriage, a hopeful, secret creation. Her fingers brushed against the soft wool, and a grief so sharp and sudden it stole her breath lanced through her. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, a cruel taunt. Barren. Incomplete. A mercy to accept it. A strangled sob escaped her lips, and she sank to the floor, the booties clutched in her hand. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart crumbled into dust. She was unaware of the cabin door opening, unaware of Cale's presence until a shadow fell over her. She looked up, mortified, her face streaked with tears. He stood in the doorway, a brace of quail in his hand, his eyes fixed on the tiny booties in her fist. There was no pity in his gaze, none of the condescending sorrow she had seen in the faces of the women in town. There was only a deep, profound recognition. He set the birds down gently on the table and knelt, not close enough to touch her, but close enough to share the small space of her sorrow. His silence was an invitation, not a judgment.
"They told me I could never,"
she began, the words catching in her throat, thick with shame. A home without laughter, she finally managed to choke out. Cale looked away from her, his gaze turning to the fire crackling in the hearth. His own face was a mask of old, weathered pain. For a long time, he said nothing. The only sounds were her ragged breaths and the spitting of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rasp, heavy with a history she could only guess at. "The spirits gave my wife a garden," he said, his eyes still on the flames. "But no seeds would grow." He paused, swallowing hard. "The medicine man said the fault was mine. He said my spirit was a dry riverbed, a dry riverbed." The words hung in the air between them, a mirror to her own cursed womb. He, too, had been branded. He, too, had been judged barren. In that moment, he was no longer the silent Modoc warrior, the savage outsider. He was a man who understood her exact pain, the unique shame of a body that had betrayed its most fundamental purpose. He had not offered comfort or empty platitudes. He had offered a piece of his own brokenness, a shard of his soul that perfectly matched hers. She looked from the tiny booties in her hand to the hard, grief-stricken lines of his face, and for the first time, the crushing weight of her loneliness began to lift. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of the Henshaw brothers. They were land grabbers, carrion birds in human form who preyed on the weak and the isolated. They rode up to the homestead one morning, their horses trampling the small herb garden Elara had painstakingly coaxed from the dry soil. Jebediah, the elder, was a big, beefy man with a cruel mouth and small, greedy eyes. His brother, Silas, was a weaselly echo, always a step behind. "Well now, look what we have here," Jebediah boomed, his eye sweeping over the property with an owner's arrogance. He dismounted, his gaze falling on Elara with leering contempt. "Still here, Widow Thorne? Thought you'd have packed up and run back to whatever hole you crawled out of by now." Elara's hand instinctively went to the doorframe, her knuckles white. "This is my land," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "My husband filed the claim." Jebediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your husband's dead. And this land's too much for a lone woman." Especially a fruitless 1 inch. The insult landed like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. It was then that Cale emerged from the barn, moving with a silent grace that was both fluid and menacing. He held a sharpening stone and a knife, but he made no overt threat. He simply stood there, his presence a sudden, immovable mountain. Jebediah's eyes narrowed. "And what's this? Got yourself a redskin for protection." He spat on the ground near Cale's feet. "You think this savage is gonna scare us off? We know who he is. Last of a dead tribe." An exile. Cale's expression did not change, but Elara saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. He remained still, his silence more potent than any shouted threat. Silas shifted nervously in his saddle. "Maybe we should come back later, Jeb," he whined. "No," Jebediah snarled, his focus locked on Cale. "This land is as good as ours. The law doesn't look too kindly on squatters, especially his kind. And a woman of your reputation, shacking up with him." He let the insinuation hang in the air, thick and poisonous. "We'll be back," he promised, his eyes glittering with malice. "And when we come, you'll be gone." One way or another they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating sense of dread in their wake. Elara looked at Cale. The air between them was electric with the coming storm. The Henshaw's threat was not an idle one. They began a campaign of attrition, a slow, cruel tightening of a noose. A week later, Elara found the creek downstream from her property dammed with rocks and fallen logs, cutting her water supply to a trickle. It was a day's hard labor for Cale to clear it, his movements filled with a controlled anger she had not seen before. Another time, they woke to find a dozen of her chickens slaughtered, their bodies strewn across the yard in a gruesome display. It was a message. You are helpless. You are vulnerable. We can touch you whenever we want. Fear became Ilara's constant shadow once more, but now it was different. It was no longer the paralyzing despair of loneliness, but the sharp, clarifying fear of a fight for survival. And she was not alone in that fight. She watched Cale, saw how he adapted. He began to patrol the perimeter of the homestead at night, a silent ghost in the moonlight. He set subtle traps and snares, not to kill, but to warn, tripwires made of vine that would rattle a string of tin cans, piles of brush arranged to make noise if disturbed. He was teaching her, too, without words. He showed her how to track, how to read the signs in the dirt, how to distinguish the sound of a deer from the sound of a man. He took the old rifle, cleaned and oiled it with meticulous care, and then handed it back to her. He set up a target on a distant tree and watched, his expression unreadable, as she practiced, her aim growing steadier with each shot. He was preparing her. He was preparing them both. One evening, as they shared a meal on the porch, the unspoken barrier of the cabin having dissolved in the face of the shared threat, he handed her a small object. It was a bird, carved from a piece of pale cartonwood, its line simple but elegant, its wings poised for flight. She turned it over in her palm, the wood smooth and warm. It was the first gift she had received in years. She looked at him, her eyes asking the question she couldn't voice. "A hawk," he said, his voice low. "It does not flee the storm. It uses the wind to rise." It was the longest sentence he had ever spoken to her. She clutched the wooden bird, its symbolic weight settling deep in her soul. He was not just protecting her body or her land. He was tending to her spirit, showing her that strength could be found not in avoiding hardship, but in facing it. The night the Henshaws returned, the moon was shrouded in clouds, leaving the world in an inky, oppressive blackness. A dog they didn't own began to bark frantically from the woods, a sharp, panicked sound that was cut off abruptly. Cale was instantly on his feet, melting into the shadows beside the cabin. He pressed a hand against the wall, a signal. "Stay inside. Be ready." Ilara's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved to the window, the rifle in her hands feeling both heavy and solid. She could hear them now, the clumsy rustle of men trying and failing to be stealthy. A flicker of orange caught her eye. The barn. They had set fire to the barn. Flames began to lick up the dry timber, casting a hellish, dancing light across the yard. It was a diversion. "Come on out, widow!" Jebediah's voice roared from the darkness. "Or we'll burn the whole damn place down with you and your pet engine inside." Smoke was already beginning to sting her eyes. She had a choice: stay in the cabin and be consumed by the fire, or face the men outside. She looked at the hawk Cale had carved, sitting on the mantelpiece. "It uses the wind to rise." She took a deep breath, her fear solidifying into cold resolve. She would not be a victim huddled in a burning box. A shadow detached itself from the far side of the woodpile. Silas Henshaw, holding a torch, creeping towards the cabin. But another shadow, faster and more silent, detached itself from the darkness behind him. Cale. He moved like a hunting panther, a blur of focused lethality. There was no war cry, no sound at all but the soft thud of a body hitting the earth. From the other side of the yard, Jebediah shouted his brother's name, confused. Ilara raised the rifle, finding his large silhouette illuminated by the barn fire. She fired. The shot was deafening, the recoil jarring her shoulder. She missed, the bullet splintering the fence post beside him, but it was enough. Jebediah ducked, cursing, his attention now split. It was the opening Cale needed. He launched himself from the shadows, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The ensuing fight was not a brawl, it was a swift, brutal conclusion. The flash of Cale's knife, the sickening crack of bone, a choked cry that was swallowed by the roar of the flames. Then, silence, save for the crackling fire. Ilara stood in the doorway, the rifle smoking, her body trembling not with fear, but with a fierce, primal surge of adrenaline. Cale walked out of the darkness and into the firelight, his face grim, his breathing heavy. He stopped before her, his gaze meeting hers across the terrible tableau. They had faced the fire and the wolves together, and they had won. In the grey light of dawn, the homestead was a scene of devastation and survival. The barn was a smouldering skeleton, a black scar against the pale sky. The bodies of the Henshaw brothers lay still and silent in the dirt. A grim, necessary silence hung over the land. Cale was already at work, dousing the last of the embers. Ilara brought him a bucket of water, her movement stiff and sore. She had a long gash on her arm from a splintered piece of wood, and he had a deep bruise darkening on his cheek. They worked together without speaking, clearing the debris, erasing the violence of the night. Later, she cleaned the cut on his face with a wet cloth, her touch gentle. He did not flinch, but stood perfectly still, his eyes closed. It was an act of profound trust, an intimacy forged in the crucible of shared combat. He then tended to the gash on her arm, his large, rough hand surprisingly careful as he bound the wound with clean strips of linen. The physical contact was a current running between them, speaking of everything their words could not. They were bound now, not by necessity or by pity, but by the indelible ink of a shared fight for their lives. That evening, they sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge in the clear, cold sky. The ruin of the barn stood as a stark monument to what they had overcome. The silence was no longer empty or tense, it was full, a rich tapestry of understanding. "My people have a story," Cale said softly, his voice breaking the long quiet. "About two stars that were cast out of the sky because they could not burn as brightly as the others. They wandered the darkness alone, lost. But then they found each other. And when they stood together, their light was greater than any single star in the sky." He did not look at her as he spoke, but his meaning was as clear as the constellations above them. They were the two exiled stars. She looked at his strong profile, at the deep well of sorrow in his eyes that was now mirrored by an equally deep resilience. The doctor's words, the town's judgment, the label of barren, they all seemed like echoes from another life, words that no longer had the power to define her. She had defended her home. She had faced death and had not broken. Her worth was not measured by what her body could or could not produce, but by the strength of her spirit. Months turned into a year. The season cycled, and the land began to heal. Together, they built a new barn, its timbers strong and true. The grass grew back over the scorched earth. The homestead was no longer a place of solitude and sorrow, but a sanctuary of quiet collaboration. Ilara's garden thrived under her care and Cale's knowledge of the soil. The cabin, once a monument to loss, was now filled with the quiet hum of a shared life. They were two solitary souls who had, against all odds, created a home. Family, she had come to understand, was not about blood. It was not about fulfilling a prescribed role. It was about the stubborn, tenacious act of choosing to stand with someone, of building a life on the common ground of respect and shared survival. It was in the unspoken gesture of him leaving a rare wildflower on her windowsill, and her saving him the last piece of berry pie. It was a family forged in silence, fire, and mutual defense. She was not the broken woman the wind had once threatened to sweep away. She was the hawk, rising on the storm. Cale was not the last of a dead tribe, a dry riverbed. He was the unwavering star who had found his counterpart in the darkness. One cool evening, they stood together watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and rose. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. His grasp was warm, solid, a silent promise. She laced her fingers through his, a response that needed no words. They had no children of the flesh, no laughter of infants to fill the rooms. But their home was not empty. It was full to the brim with a quiet, resilient love, a light they had created together, bright enough to hold back the vast and lonely darkness. Looking out at the horizon, at the future they would build upon this hard-won earth, Ilara Thorne knew she was not barren. Her life was, at long last, gloriously, miraculously, full.